And joining us now on the debate in Eugene, Oregon, Jane Kramer, political science professor at the University of Oregon. In Calgary, Alberta, Tarek Ismail, professor of political science at the University of Calgary. In Washington, D.C., Michael O'Hanlon, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And joining us here in studio, Thabit Abdullah, professor of history at York University, and Janice Stein, TVO's foreign affairs analyst and director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. And it's good to have everybody back. Michael, haven't seen you in a long time, so nice to have you on the program again. Thabit, same to you. And we wish you well with your second edition, just out, A Short History of Iraq.
Thank you.
I want to start by putting up these numbers that are courtesy of the Brookings Institution on civilian fatalities. And what jumps out at you quite clearly as the bar graph goes up, 2006, 34,000 plus deaths. These are civilian fatalities in Iraq, and look where we are in 2010, admittedly the year not quite over yet, but a dramatic difference. And I want to start there, just over 2,000 and change, which of course is a tragedy, those 2,000 people and their families. However, we're a long way from 2006. Michael O'Hanlon, this is your institution that put these numbers together, so let's get into some explanation of how that's happened. Give me some reasons why it's happened.
And first, let me say thank you not only to your show, but to places like casualties.org and the Iraq body count that have also helped with these casualty counts. And what I would say is fundamentally, of course, Iraqi politics were a crucial determinant of what happened here because we saw the Sunni awakening, the Sunni tribes basically deciding that al-Qaeda was a greater threat than the United States or even the Shia militias. And then we saw the Shia militias decide essentially to go to a ceasefire or to continue the ceasefire of Muqtada al-Sadr. But none of that would have been adequate without the fundamental change in military operations that American, British, and most of all perhaps Iraqi forces carried out. Greater numbers of American troops, of course, and gradually increasing and improving numbers of Iraqi troops, but also tactics that focused on population protection and that built up barriers in Baghdad even more than before to protect places like markets, to really stop the cycle of sectarian killing and retribution that had begun to rip Iraq apart at the seams. And so it was really a fundamental change across all these different areas of effort, and I'm not sure any one can be given the primary credit for what transpired. As you point out, the change was so dramatic that it would presumably have to be a number of things working together.
No, fair enough, but Tarek Ismail, let me get you to weigh in on what certainly American observers, or many American observers, I guess, particularly from the previous administration would say, and that is the surge worked. You want to give that much credit to the surge?
Well, I don't think so. Actually, I would challenge the figures, looking at the figures from other perspectives. I think you will have a different picture. Yes, there is a dramatic reduction in number of casualties, but the numbers are still very high. If you talk to people inside the country and you look at the security picture, you will be amazed how our picture is much more rosy than the normal conditions of Iraq today really are. So I think we're oversimplifying, and to some degree, we're accepting figures that do not really match reality. So on these bases, I'll say, I know they're estimates. I know they're based on people's, if you will, available sources and resources, but I think the numbers are not as rosy as they make them sound. And I'm afraid if we don't recognize that there are continuous, serious problems. Remember, we do not accept the fact that there is an occupation, and there is public rejection of the occupation, and there is the so-called sectarian environment, which is originally very alien to Iraq in political terms. There was social sectarianism, just like everybody else. But now the base of the new system, i.e. the political system, is sectarianism, and the whole fabric of Iraqi society somehow is destroyed. On these bases, I say we have started a serious problem that will not go away, and the degree of reduction in direct casualties, while they may be less, but the numbers are much, much higher than what we were told.
Let me get Thabit Abdullah's view on that. Does Iraq not seem a more secure place to you today than it was, say, 4 years ago?
Well, I echo Professor Ismail's caution with regard to these numbers. But my sense is that the situation has improved For example, I've been invited to return, and I think I will take up this invitation to go and return to the country to give some talks. I think there is an element here also of a resilient Iraqi nationalism that continues to make itself felt. The fact that Maliki, for all the corruption that's associated with his regime and all the inadequacies, has been able to build a power base, pretty much dependent on the army, that includes important sectors of the Sunni and Shia community, both the leadership. I think there really is an achievement here. There's certainly an improvement in terms of the services that the country is receiving, such as better electricity, better water supply.
Hold off on that. I got charts on that are also from Brookings, and we're going to go through some of that.
But this doesn't take away from the fact that the country still is at a knife's edge, and much of this is hanging on a thread.
Let me get Jane Kramer's view on that. A knife's edge, or are things better?
Well, no doubt things are better today than they were in 2006. But I would just say two things about this Iraq index and the improvements we see in Iraq. First, the Iraq index is based upon self-reporting by the Department of Defense primarily, and other similar reports. The casualty numbers, for example, are completely questionable. We had studies, scholarly studies done in 2006 that came up with much higher numbers than the civilian casualties of 400,000 to 650,000 dead, with much better methodology for coming up with these numbers. But more importantly, the decrease in violence today should be seen most likely as a hiatus and not as a beginning of a lasting peace, because the political solutions necessary to cause a lasting peace are not in place. Borders between the provinces haven't been decided, oil sharing hasn't been decided, and many other issues. So we don't know if the peace is at all lasting.
Janice, on that last point, what would you say?
I don't use the word peace. I think that's a misnomer, frankly. What really matters to me, and we can argue about the numbers, you know, the Lancet did a study with numbers that were closer, frankly, to Michael's than some of the others. So we can argue about the numbers. That's not going to get us very far. I think the really crucial thing in Iraq, and Thabit really talked about this, is politics are happening in Iraq. And politics is a process of negotiation and bargaining. And what's interesting about what's happening in Iraq is that there's bargaining across the sectarian divisions, as you said, Thabit. And that is the core element that has to happen. And we're actually beginning to see that. Now, it took 9 months to form a government.
I think that's the longest ever of
that
any
is,
country,
no,
isn't
no,
it?
Belgium.
Belgium is, okay, Belgium's
so this
longer.
is not unique to Iraq, but so it's extraordinarily slow, hazardous, fragile. I think all those words are right. I think no, it would be foolish to say that Iraq has turned the corner, but nevertheless, something important is happening because we see Sunni Shia bargaining and a capacity to engage in the kinds of politics which is characteristic of all societies that are able to settle profoundly important disagreements without killing each other.
Michael, I don't want to turn this into a program about you know, the veracity of your numbers or you know, that kind of a thing, but some allegations have been made here today about you know, how accurate the numbers are. Is there anything you just want to say in response to that briefly?
Well, I do have to quibble a little bit, frankly, with the way the show's begun, not with my other guests, frankly, but with the implication that somehow I'm defending the state of Iraq as a rosy place. That's not the message that I would have begun with you if you had asked me to summarize the overall message out of my Iraq index or our numbers. Yes, the violence has reduced dramatically, but the place was in all-out civil war, and it is still a very violent place. I agree emphatically with everything that's been said. I also would agree emphatically that while politics have broken out, and that's good, there is no telling where they will go, and that is worrisome. And there are plenty of reasons to be concerned here. So please don't let me come across, or don't couch questions that make it sound as if I am trying to paint Iraq as a rosy place. But I think the idea that Iraq's violence has been reduced by 90% is a pretty solid finding. And if I would suggest we might want to either divide this show or a future show into two parts. One is the historical methodological question of how much Iraq has improved. But a separate question is, where is Iraq today, and what are the prospects for its further progress or for stabilizing and securing these improvements that so far I think are very fragile? Two entirely separate questions that we should not conflate.
Michael, you're a darn good television producer, because those are actually two very good topics for two very different programs. But let me follow up anyway on this. And Jane, let me go to you with this one. Last month, New York Times, Tom Friedman wrote a column and said, quote, "We need to finish our work in Iraq," we Americans, I guess he meant, "which still has the potential to be a long-term game changer in the Arab Muslim world." To that end, what do you think, Jane, that the United States needs to do, since they're taking the troops out, in order to make that happen?
Well, I think this is a bizarre thing to say finish the work in Iraq when we don't even really know why we're there. I do a lot of research on why we went, and it is not clear why we're there. But if it is to just stabilize Iraq, we don't have the political clout or the resources to finish that job. Politically, the sides would want us there. Somebody should ask us to stay there. And even though they might desperately ask us to stay there, it would take unlimited resources for us to stabilize this very fragile, as other people have said, place. Right now, we are spending about $50 billion this year, although that is a conservative number on Iraq. That is not sustainable. We cannot keep doing that. Historically, we've spent $746 billion without future costs taken into account, which include veterans benefits and interest on the deficit spending that has funded this war, which will be over $3 trillion ultimately. We just don't have these resources, and there is no political reconciliation in sight that makes this worth it to us.
Well, the issue of why the United States and its allies are there, I think producer O'Hanlon would say, is yet a third program. Sadly, we've got to focus on the one program that we're trying to do today, and I'm going to follow up with this. Tariq Ismail, why don't you try this one? With the drawdown of the United States now happening, do you believe the Iraqi army and the police are ready to take over the security of the people?
Of course not. If you look at what's happening, you will find out that there is no really police structure, there is no army structure, there are all kinds of confused, some sort of extension of the existing sectarian groupings. It's very well documented, and those of us who read the Arabic newspapers, especially the Iraqi newspapers, you can deduct this trend easily. And what's happening in Iraq today, especially the last 2 or 3 weeks, despite the fact that we seem to think, or at least like to think, that things are stabilizing and things are getting better, this is not the case. For example, the religious extremist sectarian groupings that are in control today are stirring all kinds of public reactions that they never expected. For example, the last 3 or 4 days, the crackdown on clubs, i.e. private clubs. One example of those is the club of the Literary Association. These people have really been very careful not to get entangled with the system, avoid any confrontation with the system, and to some degree try to coexist with it. All of a sudden, the municipality of Baghdad decided to ban all the clubs, including the clubs that they eat in and sometimes have a drink in it. Thus, there were reactions that were really cross-racial, cross-sectarian, cross-class, and cross-political orientations to the streets, shouting and challenging the government on some bases that are really simple, i.e. The whole idea of give me some freedom.
Okay, let me follow up on this then.
Me.
Let me follow up on one of these points that Tariq made with you, Thabit, and that is, part of the challenge of Iraq has been getting the Sunnis to buy into the notion that they're part of the army, they're part of the police, they have a responsibility as part of the reconciliation of the country to make it all work. Is that happening in your view?
Well, a long time ago, before the American occupation, before Saddam Hussein's dictatorship, when Baghdad was one of the great cities of the world, there was a common wisdom that intellectuals make for very bad politicians, because intellectuals tend to focus on the details and can't come up with a decisive answer to any question. So I don't have a decisive answer to that question. What I can tell you is that there is, in my opinion, much more to the politics of Iraq than Sunni, Shia, Kurd. There is, for example, a decimation of the middle classes and their replacement with criminal elements that come from various sects of the community, which are ill-equipped to really manage the country. Another very important theme, I think, in terms of the instability, when we were talking about the presence of the Americans, is the fact that the conflict between the United States and Iran greatly undermines the country. I think in terms of the Sunni presence, I personally am a little more optimistic than Professor Ismail, who I have enormous respect for, and we've worked quite a bit together on various projects on Iraq. But I believe that there is a greater element of Sunni participation, a greater element of cross-sectarian participation in trying to build up an Iraqi nationalism. I completely concur that it is very fragile. Much of these debates that are going on right now, for example, on dividing the ministries, on exactly this new committee that has been proposed for Alawi's party to take charge of, the exact nature of it, all of this is hanging on a thread. But I do see an improvement. I see an improvement in the security situation that is very clear. I know that from my own relatives and friends in the country that now can go out at night, that they can go visit people and they were not able to do so. And this is extremely important in terms of the economic and political development.
I got some numbers here, actually, and this is, again, courtesy of Brookings, and you know, okay, we're not going to spend a lot of time here quibbling about the accuracy of these, but they seem to be all trending in the same direction. Michael, let's bring these up. This is across a number of different metrics, the availability of essential services comparing Feb 08 with Feb 09. And if you look at sewage, it's almost 3 times better. If you look at access to potable water, you've got twice as many people today hooked up. If you look at electricity, again, twice as good today, or excuse me, twice as good in Feb 09 as in Feb 08. Fire department services, again, almost twice as good. Let's look at a few more. Fuel, does it meet the demand? Almost twice as good. Public health, more than twice as good. Housing, twice as good. Population have adequate housing. Trash, do they pick up the garbage? Almost 3 times as good.
There's one more, Steve, that's extremely important.
Which one is
report,
not there that you think
which is
should
the sense of optimism. Do you think that the future will be better?
And what is it?
And there's an enormous improvement in terms of people who believe that the future will be better.
And you know, one you absolutely have to mention, because I have friends who, weddings. There is and that's a sense of optimism. There are marriages now, and there are very elaborate weddings in banquet halls and this sort of thing, which did not take place for 2 or 3 years.
I think there are 2 things we have to keep in mind. One, what part of Iraq you're talking about? Are you talking about Basra, for example? Are you talking about Diwaniyah? For example, last night I read one of the interesting pieces of news, the tribalization of urban areas such as Diwaniyah, Hilla, and other places. For the first time in the history of the country, things become so tribalized. Sheikhs are opening offices to accept people's appeals to the government to do certain things, and the government seemed to have accepted those sheikhs being the intermediary between the population and the government, and gradually those sheikhs are playing a role that really disappeared all the last, for a long time. So you tribalize the society, and then with it you have added the religious leadership's blessing, if not to some degree espousing these tribalizations. That's one. In the north, it's entirely different. By the way, I'm leaving to the north tomorrow early morning, and I have been to 2-3 times, and I have been to Iraq too, and I have been in contact with a lot of people.
Let's get an answer to your question.
Hang on. My question is, what part of the country you're talking about?
Exactly.
In the north, it is very clearly well organized. The government, to some degree, is more democratic. I say some degree. More importantly, the services are superb. The public peace is very much visible.
Okay,
and
Tariq,
clearly,
you've asked a good question, and I want to see if I can get an answer. Michael O'Hanlon, these are your numbers. Hang on, no, not one more thing. We're running out of time, and I got to spread the time here. Michael O'Hanlon, could you please come in here, and these are your numbers, and tell us again more about the background, perhaps what part of the country these represent, or how widespread they are, and how permanent they are. Go ahead.
Well, it does vary from issue to issue, but comprehensively, they're meant to be nationwide. And let's remember that Kurdistan the north, is only about 17%, 18% of the total population. So you cannot get good results on a national scale just because Kurdistan is doing well. So there has been major progress. But even if I disagree with my friend from Calgary on the specifics of that particular issue, let me agree with him in a broader spirit. Because one of the things we have in the index that I've tried to track, and that he's much more expert than I at understanding, but nonetheless we've tried to follow, is Iraqi political progress, reconciliation across sectarian lines, progress on issues like the Article 140 in the Constitution, which means there are disputed territories in the north between Kurds, Turkoman, and Arabs that have not been resolved and still have not been resolved, integration of many of the sons of Iraq into government jobs. On these sorts of questions, there has not been progress. You just mentioned that the 9-month delay in forming a government was the longest in recorded human history. I agree very much with Janice Stein that politics has broken out in Iraq, and that's a very promising thing. Unfortunately, the resolution of specific problems has not made a very good headway in 2010. It's been a frustrating year, and I remain, frankly, almost as worried about overall trends as Tariq, even if on the numbers, I will stand by our assessment that things have gotten a whole lot better in most categories.
Janice Stein.
Yeah, I agree with Michael. If fundamentally, we do have a political process in place, which I can't overemphasize. And it's interesting, actually. Just take 1 second, Steve, and compare where Iraq is right now, where Egypt is, which has had an openly fraudulent election, openly, nakedly fraudulent election, in which one party won virtually all the seats. Talk about frozen politics.
In a so-called well-established
In a
Middle Eastern
so-called
democracy.
well-established, stable country. So I think that's very, very important for people to understand. That having been said, there are
the growth of sectarianism.
and the growth of sectarianism. The fact that we are seeing an increasing role for some of the sheikhs, depending on which part of the country you're in, is actually, for me, a positive sign, because some of the traditional intermediaries, which actually make a society more flexible, more resilient, have come back. One of the worst aspects of Saddam's rule was, in fact, that he did away with a lot of these intermediary structures, and that's what made the society so brittle and so easy to dominate. So some of that messiness is actually encouraging. Are there big issues around distribution of revenue from resources, Kurdish issues? These are huge issues, but as long as there's a political process in place, that's a better place to be than frozen politics.
Okay, let me go to Jane Kramer in Oregon on this one then. Whether it was Belgium or whether it was Iraq, the fact is it took many, many, many more months to put a government together in Iraq than people would have liked. And I'm wondering what kind of impact that had on Iraqis in your view.
Well, I would say that it is, every commentator here basically has said it is fragile. Right. And that, for the Iraqis, what does that mean? The situation is so fragile that we want to know, are they really embarking on sharing political power, or are they trying to outmaneuver each other? I would say that Iraqis feel better, and if you're an optimist, it looks better, but it is so fragile because almost all things we see going on look like political maneuvering to position for future conflicts because the main issues haven't been resolved. And so I would argue that it looks much more like the calm before a storm or some sort of hiatus instead of real committed power sharing. Now, it's not clear because political elites look like they're a little more realistic than they used to be. I would agree. They seem like they're maneuvering to figure something out, but we have a lot of things to figure out, and almost none of the main issues have been really resolved.
Jane, just follow up on this. You said the calm before the storm. What's the storm?
Well, the storm is, how are we going to share oil wealth? How are we going to determine undecided borders, which is really hugely a problem? How are we going to provide security? Who's going to be in those security forces? And basically, how are we going to share power at the center instead of just divide it? They have to actually work in good faith to run a democracy. And I think almost no one who's credible would argue that it looks like it's going to be a democracy. It looks like it's going to fall apart for most of us. Most of us think
let me get Thabit Abdullah and then Tariq Ismail to respond.
Fragile, yes, it is fragile, but it was inevitable in the post-Saddam period that it would be fragile. This country has gone through some of the most incredible traumatic events that any country in the 20th century has witnessed. It has gone through 40 years of one of the most vicious fascisms of the modern era. three of the most brutal wars, a sanction regime that is the most destructive in history, and an American occupation that destroyed the state without really filling the vacuum. No doubt it is going to be fragile, no matter what kind of ideal setup you dream of. I fully suspected this, and the country certainly will have to work through it. The fact that there are centrifugal forces, the fact that Iraqi society is extremely brittle, this all was clearly evident during the sanctions period under Saddam Hussein, including the rise of the sheikhs and their power, which Saddam Hussein was the first to empower them. Now, it will take time. I do not believe that Iraq has any kind of divine right to emerge out of this as a strong, unified country. But the kind of difficulties that it is going through are fully predictable.
Tariq Ismail.
I must admit, we all began talking about Iraq during the American occupation and after. I think we should look further in its history, and more importantly, look at some of the basic. Those of us who know Iraq well and have studied Iraq well always refer to a great political sociologist, Ali al-Wardi, who really, I think, if it was read by anybody, would have gotten the clues of what has happened in Iraq, i.e., that once unleash sectarianism, you will have no way controlling it, because that's how the whole society falls apart. That's one. The second, and he made that very clear, that Iraq is a country of henchmen, jalawza, as he called it. So you can always have people who will be capitalizing and taking advantage and tearing the society apart. All what you have to do is give them the chance. And my fear, Iraqis today compare themselves to the pre-occupation. You all know that I am, and I have been all my life writing and critically evaluating Saddam Hussein, and never thought Saddam Hussein would have been able to represent Iraq in every shape or in any shape or form. However, it's not me. People are now telling me Saddam was bad. Yes, these guys are worse than Saddam, and there are so many Saddams all over the place. So when you look at all that, you got to judge politics by its final outcome. And the population, yes, we can talk about objectives and getting into the war and what did America achieve. I think Jane put her finger on the issue. The issue is what is going to happen to Iraq. Is there a politics? Come on. The politics of today is unbelievable. They have not yet. You all seem to think they have agreed on a cabinet. They have not agreed on a cabinet. And the arrangement that was done, if you follow the process, you will find out all fake all the way through. Maliki lost 89 seats only. Then all of a sudden, he was forming a coalition with another group. And there were all kinds of other games being played. The Kurds played a very important role.
Okay, let me jump in here. We're down to 6 minutes, and I want Janice Stein to respond, and then I want to put one more graph up. Responding to what Professor Ismail said.
Well, it depends how you think of what you think of as politics. You know, and Jane, I understand where you're coming from, but there is a kind of romantic notion of what a democracy is that doesn't fit North America, much less Iraq. Everybody maneuvers for political advantage. I mean, look at our own House of Commons, all right? And look what goes on in Washington right now. So we have to be reasonable here. What you're seeing in Iraq, and I want to come back and make this point, you are seeing coalitions maneuvering for political advantage, engaging in politics, in negotiation, in give and take, to increase their own relative advantage within the political process.
So that's normal.
That is normal, and that is significantly different from what Iraq has gone through in the previous 40 years.
Last set of Brookings numbers. Hang on, sorry, running out of time here. Running out of time. Let me put up these numbers from Brookings. Michael, if you wouldn't mind. One last thing, because this seems very much in contradistinction to what Professor Ismail just had to say. Michael O'Hanlon, you get the first kick at this because these are your numbers. Asked in February 2009, how are things overall in Iraq? And you see the overall numbers, 58% say very or quite good, 41% only very or quite bad. If you break that down among Shia, the Shia are very overwhelmingly quite pleased with the way things are, 2/3 to 1/3. The Sunnis, not so much, 46-51, 46 saying good, 51 saying bad. Kurds, 51-48 saying good versus bad. Okay, Michael, your inference from those numbers is what?
Well, first of all, they are promising, but they're also 2 years old. And so we do have to ask, how have they evolved since then? And specifically, since this 2010 period of crucial election developments. And that's why I say that even though I've been a fan of Iraqi politicians and would strongly disagree with Tariq when he refers to them as sort of the new batch of Saddams, I could not disagree more. Nonetheless, there has been a stalemate in progress in the last year or so. And therefore, even though I fundamentally agree with Janice Stein in saying politics is a promising way and a much better way to solve problems than violence, I'm worried and share some of Jane's concerns that, in fact, we could see a reversion to violence if there isn't significant headway on at least one or two of the big issues that have been so stubborn and so difficult to make headway on. So I've been encouraged, I've been impressed. I think Iraqis deserve a lot of credit and should feel proud of what they did, especially from 07 to 09, reflecting the numbers that you just mentioned. But I'm worried that the last year or so has been a bit too much paralysis, stagnation, and treading water for what Iraq really needs.
Jane Kramer, do you believe, as somebody who shares your last name, Richard Ben Kramer wrote a book called What It Takes. Do you think this current Prime Minister of Iraq has what it takes to make it work?
You know, I think that the real problem is that whether Janice made the point that it's politics, but in a democracy or in any group society where people get along, they don't fight over who controls the army. And that if you haven't resolved that yet, and if you make threats, as we heard recently about I still control the army, that is fundamentally problematic for future prospects of building a real political solution. People have to decide to settle things politically and not violently, and that is what we haven't seen. So does the current Prime Minister have the ability to make it work? He's not very widely supported, and I don't have a lot of faith in it. I think it's really fragile. I hope the best, but I'm not an optimist.
Less than 2 minutes, Thabit Abdullah. Does he have what it takes? Nouri al-Maliki.
I don't think any of the political leaders have really risen to the occasion in terms of being truly charismatic and forward-looking, but that doesn't really matter. I believe that solely through the fear of mutual self-destruction, there is gradually an attempt to create bridges and reach agreements. And this, to me, is a positive sign, and one that, frankly, I didn't really expect to see so quickly emerging after the disasters that were left over from Saddam Hussein's period and from the terrible period of the American occupation.
Janice.
Just look at Lebanon. They're fighting over who controls the army. It's on a nice edge in Lebanon. So I agree with Jane that these are big issues, but so far the Iraqis are doing it through political bargaining. I would also echo what Michael says. It would be wonderful to see one issue move forward now on the political agenda, even the distribution of oil revenues, which is one of the biggest issues. If there was some tangible progress, that would be, I think, on a particular issue. Not all of them, and often politics is going around issues rather than dealing with them head on, but some visible progress that could be encouraging to Iraqis would be extraordinary right now.
And as she often does, Janice Stein gets the last word. Thanks to all 5 of our guests for coming in tonight to help us with this discussion. Jane Kramer at the University of Oregon, Tariq Ismail, University of Calgary, Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institution in Washington, Thabit Abdullah, York University, Janice Stein, University of Toronto, and the Munk School. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate your time tonight.